네,
Ladies and gentlemen, nice to see you again. Now we are going to begin the first session, keynote presentation session of 2021 Seoul Big Data Forum. And today we are going to be joined by Professor Alex Pentland and Professor Bin Jiang of Yale University. These two speakers have joined us online as keynote presenters. And as for the YouTube channel, we are going to be receiving questions real time through comment section. So if you have any questions, please leave your comments. We look forward to your strong interest and support for the keynote session. Now, moderator is Professor Ha-jun of Yonsei University. He's here on the stage offline. Allow me to introduce Professor Ha-jun to you. He has been working as the Professor of Construction and Environment Engineering Department of Yonsei University since 2005. And he has also worked as a CTO of a startup company named Forest One based in Illinois. And he has also provided technology services to many Fortune 500 companies. He has written for more than 1,000 articles and made more than 150 academic presentations. And he is also offering MOOC lecture for space science, spatial science and application. Please welcome Professor Ha with a big hand. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Ha-jun from Yonsei University, and it's a great honor for me to be moderating the keynote session. And the theme of this keynote session is post-COVID era and the future and challenges of urban area. We are going to be hearing from two professors for the next 2 hours. And in this era, because of this pandemic, the keynote speakers are joining us online. Let me briefly introduce these two professors to you. First, Professor Alex Pentland is a very well-known expert in this field. He has made a lot of contribution to this field of science, and he is currently the founder of MIT Media Lab. And in the computer science, his articles are most frequently referenced. He is definitely one of the 7 most powerful data scientists in the world. He has extensive experience OECD, World Bank, UN related to big data projects and has done numerous research. What's really interesting is that he has founded many companies. So Professor Pentland is somebody who can share a lot of insight with today's audience. Professor Bin Jiang is the professor of Gavle University, Geoinformatics and Computational Geographics. He's an expert in urban science, based city science. He is actively doing a lot of research for theoretical studies. So first, we would like to invite Professor Alex Pentland's lecture, and it is titled Building a New Economy, Data's Capital. How to perceive data as a new type of capital in the new economy. He will be sharing his valuable vision with us today. So we have prepared a video recording of his lecture.
What I've been doing for many years is thinking about data and society. Many years ago, I ran the first sort of wearables group that was concerned with consumer wearables, things you'd wear on your body around and how that would work. And one of the things we discovered is that cell phones are going to put off a ton of data, and that's both good in some ways because you can coordinate things, you can do science, and it's really scary, which led me to start the discussion at Davos that led to GDPR via the Justice Minister of the EU, who was part of my discussion group, and also led me to begin a series of large-scale experiments, country-scale experiments called Data for Development, where we asked what could be done with this data, and discovered that you can do all sorts of things that are positive, and that was shaped the Sustainable Development Goals. It's something that the Secretary General named the data revolution, because until just very recently, all of these sort of efforts at poverty alleviation, at development, essentially flew blind. There was very little evidence about what was happening on the ground, and now you can know a great deal more about it. I work with a number of people. As I mentioned, I'm on the board of the Sustainable Development Goals data, work with the World Economic Forum. I run a group and co-lead a group in the IEEE called the Council for Extended Intelligence, which is trying to fight against artificial intelligence. So we try to make people smarter, not machines smarter. We make the people smarter by making the machines smarter, but okay. And I work with the World Bank and other organizations which hopefully will have an influence on the world. And I want to give a sort of introduction. There's a very tall, sort of big picture introduction here, which looks at it from a sort of policy point of view. And the problem of data and privacy. And the big problem for data and AI is that nobody trusts them. Are these people acting in my interest? No, we don't know, even if they are. And so people want to control data and AI, and they want to trust in the outcomes. And that's sort of the fundamental problem for a lot of the infrastructure that we have out there right now, is that it's in too few hands. And the conclusion of sort of policymakers is that we need a new deal on data. And actually, that's the title of the paper I wrote that got the discussion that led to GDPR, a new deal on data. So GDPR is a start, but it's only a start. And the California law is a little bit better, but again, it's only a start. You need to go quite a bit further. And it has to be something that helps companies as well as citizens as well as governments. It can't just be this sort of absolutist approach to things. So you need to be able to cut through this Gordian knot to end up with a viable new deal. And the suggestion that I've made that seems to be gaining a great deal of traction is to think of data as a new means of production, very much like money or labor or land. And so the questions then have to do with who controls that new means of production, who controls the data, how is it used, who is it used for. And as Pedicke, who's the sort of icon of some of the new economics, progressive thinking, says, you know, large returns to capital, so in other words, making money off of data is not a bad in itself. The problem is that it's in too few hands. So then the question is how do we actually reconfigure our systems, our social systems and our legal systems to be able to put the power of this data in the hands of everybody? And that's, when you start thinking about it that way, you realize that for money, we have banks, we have auditors, we have government insurance. For land, we have systems that record it and allow you to check that indeed you own that and you can mortgage your land. And for labor, you have rights to return off of that, and we have labor protection laws, and we have unions and things like that. And a similar sort of infrastructure is needed for data. And AI, to me, is just patterns in data. If you control the data, you can control the AI. So I'm going to talk mostly about data. So what are some of the things we need? Well, we need mechanisms for digital identity and guaranteeing ownership rights. Ownership, I should point out, is different than, ownership rights are different than ownership. Ownership rights means that you have the ability to know what's happening, have some control over it, have a copy of it, the ability to dispose of what happens to the data. But most data is co-created. So you can't have absolute rights over it. There has to be some sort of a separation. And we can talk about that. I will talk about that a little bit. You also can't trust people about it, just like you don't trust people about money. You have to have audit. You have to have accountability. And given that AI is so powerful and so quick, you need to have continuous auditability. It's not enough to go back once a year and see if things were done correctly. You need to watch immediately. And if you can actually audit the decisions made by an AI, you can detect things like bias and other sort of socially objectionable outcomes quite quickly. And that's the type of thing that we've been doing with several countries, like for instance, to evaluate the social systems in countries like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. And you need to have criminal penalties. If you screw up with the data, you need to get your hand slapped for sure. And so the conundrum we've had in this country and actually all around the world is, how do you do this? Well, the suggestion I have is that this looks a lot like the sort of problems we had with banking back in the, say, 1870s, when farming communities felt that the banks were just, raking them over the coals. So they formed their own banking cooperatives. And those eventually matured into what we see as data co-ops, data unions, small banks, and provoked law about and regulation about banking, which may need some updating these days, but was good for quite a while, a lot better than the Wild West part. And similarly, around 1900 to 1920, you see the struggles over labor. As the nation industrialized, labor became a mean of production, and big companies dominated that unfairly. And so workers formed in communities and pushed back, and over time got rights, got the government to back them up, and you got safety protection, you got employment guarantees, you got retirement, et cetera, et cetera. Not perfect, but a lot better than it was in 1900. And now we need to do the same thing with data. We need to form into cooperatives, communities, that begin to sort of push back and demand things about it. But not just that. I think that what we need is things that are like banks or like labor unions. We're going to have data unions. And the point is that data is not particularly valuable on the individual level. I can know my data, maybe it helps me exercise better, but I can't see if I'm getting the short end of the stick from my employer. I can't see if I'm getting bad health care. I can't see if the government is treating me equally. It's aggregates, cooperatives, communities that need to look at their data and compare across people to get value. And this is, of course, the general thing for companies, is they need lots of data from lots of people to be able to do anything. So the key here for ownership, for digital identity, for auditing, and for criminal penalties is not individual ownership and control. It's too complicated. It doesn't have the sort of leverage on the problem. But if you have communities that pool their data, so still owning their data, just like in a bank, you put your money in, bank still owns it. I mean, you still own your money, but the bank can help you invest it and help push back. Same thing with a labor union. You still own your own labor, but they help you apply it in good ways. Data unions would help you do the same type of thing. So what might that look like? Well, you can imagine that there's a cooperative where people feed data off of their phones, off of their credit cards, into a bank-like thing that holds the data for them. But then that bank computes neighborhood measures. Things like, what's the employment rate in your neighborhood? What's the access to health? What are the health outcomes? A lot of the things that happen to us today in health, we aren't aware of because we don't have the data about what's happening around us. Public transport, a lot of public transport is not fair. poor communities get less public transport than rich communities, which is weird. And as a consequence, it's harder to stay employed if you're in a poor community, et cetera, et cetera. So having a dashboard that shows the conditions in your community could help you fix those, push back, and so forth. And you can see an example of this that we're doing in Australia at opportunity.mit.edu, where we show a community, in this case the city of Adelaide, using phone data, using bank data, using government data, and eventually using health data to be able to understand, plan its transportation system, plan its public health, and up employment, which is one of their major problems. So what does that community data look like? Well, it's statistics typically about like census data. So there's this differentiation between individual data, which is sensitive and you don't want to share, and aggregate data like census data. I mean, census data is made out of extremely personal data. But by aggregating it correctly, you can get things that give you a sense of what's going on in the neighborhood without exposing individuals' data, right? So that you're all familiar with. And what we do in these communities that we work with is we add another thing to it, which is things like the flows between communities, where people work, where they shop, and where they play. And it turns out that that type of rich census data, so, you know, what's the income average here, what's the health outcomes, but also where do people work, play, entertain, things like that, which do not have any individual level data in it, are extraordinarily powerful for getting better services to the community. So for instance, we've shown that in Massachusetts, you can use data like this to be able to predict surges in COVID infection 1 and 2 weeks ahead. And that's on our web pages. You can go take a look at it. But that's pretty amazing. It tells you these areas are unlikely to be have a surge. These areas are very likely to have a surge. And it turns out that the simple rules don't work. But if you can look at the aggregates like this, the flows between things, obviously disease travels with the people. So if you know the flows of the people, you can predict where it's likely to have outbreaks. And in fact, we helped MIT put together a disease control dashboard based on exactly this idea, which has been pretty successful so far. You can do other things that are surprising. So looking at cities on 4 different continents, we've discovered that there are really good predictors of economic growth on a neighborhood basis. And the thing that is the most predictive, more predictive than any of the things that people normally talk about, is diversity of amenities, stores, other sort of facilities, and diversity of the types of people that go there. What that means is people from different types of neighborhoods. It's not other sorts of diversity. And that accounts for almost 50% of the variance, which means it's a dominant factor. And the way to think about that is that some neighborhoods become hot. They become interesting and diverse, and there's a buzz. And what you're measuring there is sort of the diversity of experience, the diversity of people. And what that diversity does is it creates opportunities, attracts additional investment, and you're off to the races. Obviously, you also have to control for gentrification. We have ways of doing that as well. In fact, this predictor is so strong, you can even predict sales for stores that don't exist. What that means is you can, as a community, say, well, if we put a grocery store here, will it be successful or not? And you can do that with much greater accuracy than today's commercial systems. You can do that with daycare, with other sorts of things. So communities can begin figuring out what amenities, what facilities they need to build, and do a really good job at figuring out whether or not it'll be successful. And so you can combine that with some of the new facilities for making contracts, for enforcing economic agreements. And one of the websites you should look at is law.mit.edu, where we have I put together an association of law schools to think about how we can make digital law. And one of the interesting ones at the moment is, it turns out that in today's climate, you can make it such that instead of paying rent, people end up owning the building. So that means that gentrification helps the people that live in the neighborhood and not hurts them, which is a real transformation. From our earlier experiments, the ones that shaped the Sustainable Development Goals, we showed that you can map poverty on the neighborhood by neighborhood basis. You can map inequality. You can actually predict things like intergenerational mobility. Are your kids going to grow up better than you? You can optimize transport in ways that are really surprising and support the social goals as well as just getting people there. And so the new transportation initiative at MIT, we're part of that, to do these sorts of things. As I've said, you can predict where you should invest for infrastructure to best benefit the community and where it's likely to be successful. And something that's very relevant is you can do a much better job at managing public health by looking at the flows of people. And we're doing that again in Australia and in some other places. And there was that paper I referenced earlier. So who's beginning to do these sorts of things? Well, one of the people that we're beginning to work with is something you probably haven't heard of, called NRECA, America's Electric Cooperatives. It turns out that 56% of the American land area was electrified by cooperatives, not by government, not by companies, by communities, mostly rural communities, of course, pooling their resources to build the electric grid for their communities. And they did it in a way that was profit-making for the community, sort of a dual bottom line thing. Well, why can't we do that with internet? There's a lot of communities that don't have good internet, but if we could do it with electricity, we could do it with internet. And the same principle applied to housing and other sorts of problems. There's a number of entities that we work with. The credit unions are an example of somebody who are legally empowered to hold data of their members and use it on their behalf. They're required to be on the behalf of the members. So they're beginning to look at that so that they can make more loans to small businesses at better rates, working with consumer union to give people greater rights over their data in this sort of manner. Unions, labor unions, are very interested in this, and particularly gig economy, because they feel completely exploited, but yet the data that assigns them tasks could be aggregated to tell if they're getting a fair shake or not. And one of the more interesting ones we're doing is we're working with the Berklee School of Music on something called Open Music. We've built a platform which gives musicians more direct control over their digital data, which is their music, and is also useful for video and other sorts of things, so that they can cut out a lot of the middlemen and begin to get royalties for their music in a much more direct way and avoid some of the credible and expensive complexities of the today's music system. So those are some of the examples. This being the IEEE, I thought I would do a quick thing on how can we actually do this from a software engineering point of view. And this is important to think about this because it's also something that is sort of the soul of privacy regulation. You have to actually implement this stuff. So the key thing is avoiding big brother solutions. Data stays where it's collected. You never share data unless you absolutely have to. What you do is you share answers. So I send you a question. If you are a data holder, you decide to answer the question or not using a pre-approved algorithm. That's why we call it open algorithms. So the graphic for this is, you know, the traditional way of thinking about this is a data lake. You move the code to this lake. And it's bad in all sorts of ways. It tells the bad guys right where to go to steal the data. It becomes very hard to audit what's happening on that data. So your sort of protection for misuse is diminished. If instead you have a question and answering system, so you send questions to data holders, there's several things that happen. One is it becomes very easy to audit what's being asked and what's being answered. You can do things like bias. You can do things like social justice, et cetera, et cetera. You can also do things like you could tax the thing if you wanted to. You can, and the lawyers love it because now instead of give me your data, it's can you answer this question? The risk involved in participating in a question and answering system is dramatically less than the risk associated with actually sharing data. So we've done these sorts of systems. We helped set up Koya, which is a spin-off of Fidelity that moves data around all the major banks. So your retirement funds may be using this right now. We helped Intuit do your taxes this way. They don't like to talk about it. We helped Eurostat structure their data processes so that they can look at data, observe data localization and privacy law. We've worked with a couple of others that are notable. If you log all of this on something like a blockchain, and I know that's a loaded word, it's not Bitcoin. It's actually a lot more like Libra, which a lot of what we designed is actually built into Libra. Not the governance, not Facebook, but actually computer science and architecture. Then what you get is this sort of distributed governance of the data and the algorithms. And it becomes something that in some ways is much more trustworthy and much more transparent than today's system. So you can imagine this, for instance, with medical data. And in fact, what we've done, this is our TradeCoin platform, you can look it up. We just helped Switzerland set up such a thing, operating through Swisscom and Swiss Post. So that will exchange medical data, anything that's data, anything that's digital, also exchange traded funds, money essentially, others' personal data, in a way that's auditable, efficient, multi-stakeholders, so that there's many eyeballs on it, and so forth. And other people are doing this also. So for instance, Temasek and the Singapore Monetary Authority just released their version. It's called Project Ubin. And the Swiss trust chain is actually a commercial product now, and Ubin is just becoming that. And another thing we did is today, we helped Bermuda release their central bank digital currency, which they claim is the very first in the world to be actually released in public. And we helped them with the KYC and AML aspects of that. If you want to know more about it, we have a book, MIT Press, goes through the algorithms, talks about the design philosophy, recounts the sort of genesis of GDPR and the Sustainable Development Goals, and more. And a new one that's just out, it's still free, it's on the web. There's the web address. It says Building the New Economy. And it talks about this notion of data cooperatives and how you would actually build them and how you can empower creative artists and how you can do housing and other sort of community facilities using these sort of technologies and some of the legal aspects as well. So I'll just stop there and thank you.
네.
Thank you very much, Professor Pentland. It was a very inspirational presentation. So data will lead the future economy, and it's a very important resource. And at the same time, there are privacy issues, misuse issues, these byproducts of using data. And he has shared his alternatives and actual use case. It was a wonderful presentation. Now we are going to listen to Professor Jiang's presentation. The title of his presentation is A New Kind of City Science Built on Living Structure. It's a living structure, whether it's tangible and untangible. How living structure can create a new city science.
Thank you for the opportunity. Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this presentation. The title that I'm going to present is a new kind of city science built on living structure. Living structure is a physical phenomenon and a mathematical structure. It exists pervasively in our physical space, in buildings, in gardens, in streets, in cities, and in every part of the physical world. Living structure can be well reflected in the human mind and the heart, triggering a sense of livingness or vibrance. In other words, living structure has nurturing or healing effect. A recent study found that newborn babies, genetically healthy babies who were born during the pandemic have the lower intelligence than those who were born before the pandemic. One possible reason is that the minimalist design or non-living structure that reduces babies' intelligence. In this connection, the city science that I have been advocating appears to be at the right time. What is the city science? It is the science, technology, and art of dealing with the acquisition, storage, processing, production, presentation, and dissemination of city information in order to help address the three fundamental issues about a city: how it looks, how it works, and what it ought to be. It aims not only for better understanding city structure and dynamics, or cities are, in other words, but also for better transforming modern cities and communities to become living or more living towards a sustainable society. I will begin with three fundamental issues about cities: how they look, how they work, and what they ought to be. I will use two simple examples to illustrate living structure, which is defined under the third view of space. Space is neither lifeless nor neutral, but a living structure capable of being more living or less living. I will present the two fundamental laws of living structure and two design principles for making living or more living structures. Next, I will look at in detail the science of living structure, which is built on new theory of centers, supported by the 15 properties. These 15 properties can be well reflected in the human mind and heart, triggering a sense of liveliness or a sense of beauty. This sense of beauty can be captured by the so-called mirror of the self experiment, using human beings as a measuring instrument. The science of living structure is a new kind of science, for which I will present a research agenda in the end. There are three fundamental issues about cities: how they look, how they work, and what they ought to be. These are also three fundamental issues of geography as a science of the Earth's surface. Conventionally, geography concentrates largely on description of structure, literally meaning the description of the Earth's surface. I argued, and will argue again, that without understanding how it works or the underlying mechanism of dynamics, we cannot well describe the Earth's surface. Cities or geographical space in general are complex and non-linear systems, so they cannot be well described by Euclidean and Cartesian geometries or by the conventional statistics based on normal distribution or Gaussian statistics, so to speak. More importantly, structure or morphology is the outcome of dynamics. So the second issue is larger than the first one, or second issue contains the first one. The third issue is about how to make cities to be living or more living, and it is even larger, being the largest issue among the three. The science of living structure goes beyond physics towards a design science. The notion of design or design science therefore has the largest scope, larger than physics or larger than understanding how things are. The notion of design implies that goodness of design can be measured or quantified. It is a matter of the fact rather than opinion or personal preferences as conventionally conceived. To further clarify this point, let's use a parable. Before the invention of thermometer, warmness was a kind of human feeling. Yet after the invention of thermometer, warmness became the physical concept of temperature. Nowadays, how good a city is still considered to be opinion or human feeling, but in the near future, it may become a measurable or quantifiable fact. Living structure is to livingness what temperature is to warmness. What is living structure? It is such a structure in which there are far more small substructures than larger ones. Taking the dataset of the 10 numbers, 1, a half, 1/3, and 1/10, for example, it is a living structure, for it consists of far more smalls than larges. As shown in this diagram, the average of the 10 numbers point to 9 partitions the 10 numbers into 2 parts, the head for those larger than the average, and the tail for those smaller than the average. Interestingly, this partition into the head and the tail can continue for the head again, with the second average, 0.61. The 3 numbers in the head are partitioned again into the head and the tail. Thus, the notion of far more smalls than larges recurs twice, meeting the minimal condition of being a living structure. Head-tail bricks is a new classification scheme we invented for data with a heavy tail distribution. It is a recursive function as illustrated by the dataset of the 10 numbers. Head-tail bricks has been widely used to various applications, and the method itself has also been extended from head-tail bricks 1.0 to head-tail bricks 2.0. Let's now use this painting, namely composition by the Dutch painter Pieter Mondriaan, one of the most famous 20th century artists who is well known for using simple geometric shapes and the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue. Conventionally, we see this painting consisting of the 7 pieces, among which the most salient pieces are in red, yellow, and blue. Instead of the static view or Lego-like assembly view, we can see this painting consisting of 18 recursively defined substructures, as shown in panels B, C, D, and E. In total, 18 substructures. In other words, the painting is evolved from the empty square in a step-by-step fashion. First, from panel B to C, there are far more newborn or newly generated substructures than older ones. From C to D, there are also far more newborns than older ones. Thus, the notion of far more newborns than older ones recurs twice, so it is a living structure. In addition, we can notice that there are at each iteration, except the first, far more smalls than larges. Having seen these 2 examples, it is not difficult to figure out what a living structure is. It is such a structure in which there are far more small substructures than larger ones. The notion of living structure was first developed by Christopher Alexander. It is defined under the organic or organismic worldview, which was first conceived by the British philosopher Alfred Whitehead The organismic worldview extends the mechanistic worldview to include human beings as part of the world picture. In other words, we human beings are part of the world rather than separated from the world. Under the organismic worldview, Alexander formulated the third view of space. Space is neither lifeless nor neutral, but a living structure capable of being more living or less living. Under the third view of space, the entire Earth's surface is a living structure ranging from the largest scale of the Earth's surface to the smallest, a tiny ornament of centimeters, for example. Living structure is said to be governed by two fundamental laws, scaling law and turbulence law. There is a recurring notion of far more small and larger for the larger substructures, yet more is similar for the small substructures. These two notions, far more small and larger and more is similar, underline the two fundamental laws of living structure. To generate living structure, there are two design principles, namely differentiation and adaptation. The differentiation principle means that larger substructures are differentiated or partitioned or decomposed like a cell division to generate small substructures in a step-by-step fashion, while the adaptation principle ensures that the generated substructures are well adapted to each other, that is, to meet the two fundamental laws. Living structure represents a big paradigm shift from Rene Descartes' mechanistic worldview to Alfred Whitehead's organismic worldview. Over the past 300 years of science, there are two fundamental views of space: Newtonian absolute space and the Leibniz relational space, which are both framed under the Cartesian mechanistic worldview. Current GIS is built on these two conventional views of space. For example, the two commonly used GIS representations, vector and raster formats, are based on geometric primitives of points, lines, polygons, and pixels. All these geometric primitives make good sense for computer storage and processing. However, they make little sense to the human mind. This is because we human beings focus on meaningful geometric shapes, such as streets and cities, rather than points, line, polygon, or pixels. The father of the flat geometry, Benoit Mandelbrot, used to see that Euclidean geometric shapes are cold and dry, a term with a clear sense of the feeling on it. In contrast to the feeling of cold and dry, the term living structure conveys some positive feelings on it. Over the years, I have developed some novel concepts, such as nature cities and nature streets, to better understand cities as a living structure. The science of living structure is a new kind of science under the organismic worldview rather than under the currently conceived mechanistic worldview. It is built on the theory of centers, supported by the 15 properties. Living structure is such a physical structure that can be defined mathematically. In other words, the degree of liveliness or degree of beauty can be computed objectively. Importantly, the degree of beauty can be well reflected in the human mind and heart, for which a new observation method was developed, the so-called mirror of the self experiment. That is, using human beings to measure the degree of liveliness according to their own feeling, somehow like asking people to tell the degree of temperature instead of using the thermometer. Emerging geospatial big data such as nighttime imagery, open street map data, and location-based social media data provides powerful means to do the science of living structure. With emerging big data, cities or city boundaries can be delineated at the global scale across countries. The notion of nature cities is defined from the bottom up using open access big data. So it is a universal definition. It can be traced back along the time dimension to examine how cities are evolved. This slide shows the evolution of nature cities month by month using the location-based social media data of Bright Kite, with cities of Chicago and New York as two examples. By the way, X-Woman is a software we developed for topological analysis and scaling hierarchy of very large speed networks. It is widely used in space syntax community by students and urban design professionals for better understanding city structure and dynamics. Recently, we have built up an add-in for automatically deriving nature cities from very large location data. For example, over 129 million building footprints of USA and the nighttime imagery of the entire world. We have been thinking to transform X-Woman into products or services for smart city in the future. The 15 properties as the foundation of the theory of centers are pervasively occurring or recurring in nature, as well as in what we human beings build and make, including, for example, buildings, cities, and artifacts. We do not have time to get into the details of the 15 properties. However, there are a few points to make. First, these 15 properties capture very well how beautiful things look like in terms of their underlying geometry, so-called geometric properties. And in the meantime, they act as the transformation properties for design beautiful or living things. Second, the 15 properties were distilled by Christopher Alexander from his classical work of the 253 patterns, the Pentland language work. And the third, the 15 properties have been further distilled into the two laws and two design principles. In other words, the two laws, the two design principles originate from the 15 properties. We have seen previously that the painting A meets the minimal condition of being a living structure, for the notion of the far more new bones than older ones recurs twice. Here is another painting. Painting B is more structurally living, for the notion of far more new bones than older ones recurs 3 times. It is the difference of twice and 3 times makes painting B more living or more structurally beautiful. In other words, the degree of beauty or degree of liveliness can be calculated. The calculated degree of beauty or structure beauty, so to speak, can be well reflected in the human mind and the heart. It is essentially the underlying living structure that tricks a sense of the beauty or liveliness. The more substructures, the more beautiful. The high hierarchy of the substructures, the more beautiful. Alexander developed the mirror of self-experiment. 2 images or things put in parallel, side by side, and the human subject is asked to pick up one. He or she has a better sense of the feeling of belonging. Taking these 2 paintings, for example, if they are painted in the 2 t-shirts, which t-shirt you would love to have? It was found that most people would love to take the right one. Note that the mirror of self-experiment is not just a simple perception test, like or dislike, also called intersubjective agreement, but to examine the existence of living structure. In other words, it is the underlying living structure or the notion of far more small than largest, tricks the sense of beauty or sense of livingness. Recently, we have developed a computational approach to detecting living structure and subsequently design living structure of open environments. To the left of the screen, it is the city plan for the city of London. And the 6 colored panels show its 6 hierarchical levels. From them, we can see how it was transformed to become more and more living. To the right of the screen, it is part of Manhattan city plan, and the 3 colored panels show its 3 hierarchical levels. In comparison of these 2 city plans, there is little doubt that the city of London is more living or more structurally beautiful. To summarize, city science under the notion of living structure is a new kind of science or a new kind of design science. It is a science defined under the organismic worldview or under the third view of space. City science aims not only for understanding how cities are, but also for making or remaking cities to be living or more living, what the cities ought to be, so to speak. City science is dominated by non-equilibrium thinking or scaling law instead of Tobin's law. City science is no longer a minor science thinking applications of major sciences such as physics and biology, but a major science, a kind of complexity science, which may contribute to other sciences. The city science is a new kind of science for which I present briefly a research agenda here. Emergent geospatial big data, in particular location-based social media data, provide a powerful means for revealing living structure and its dynamics, and further for better understanding how human mobility or activity in general shapes and is shaped by the underlying living structure. Structure beauty of space or matter has emerged as a new concept for image understanding and computer vision. It can help measure or quantify the livingness of space. Living structure or structure beauty in particular can help assess the goodness of urban planning, that is using 2 design principles and the 15 properties to guide the urban design or planning. In other words, urban design or planning is no longer based on experts' opinion or personal preferences, but instead use beauty meat to assess goodness of urban planning. It can help transform modern cities to be living or more living. Along the value of self-experiment, neuroscientific evidence can be gathered using, for example, eye tracking fixation points and the other biometrics data. This data would prove how living structure is reflected in the human mind and the heart, and further verify how the kind of the reflection varies from people to people in terms of their cultures, gender, and races. Many thanks for your attention. I have enjoyed the presentation. Any questions and comments are welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Bin Jiang. You have talked about the new concept of future city science and living structure, how it is related to design and dynamics of urban space. In this post-pandemic world, as we talk about how the cities will change, I think you have shared a very valuable insight. Thank you very much. Are you joining us?
Now let us start the discussion session along with 2 professors who presented the plenary session. And Professor Pentland and Professor Jiang, can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right, very good. So it's really nice to meet you. And my name is Jun Hyo, a professor at Yonsei University and moderator of the plenary session today. And so now it was really insightful and wonderful presentations that provide us with some kind of new insight, what we can do, for example, with data, which is about Professor Pentland's presentation, also living structure, kind of new concept that we might be able to utilize for like city science after pandemic. So now I'm going to lead this discussion session to give individual questions to each of you, and then we're gonna get some live question that I have this pad, and if you have any question from live audience, then I'll share that question to you, and please answer the questions as well. And finally, I'll give you the answer to give you a question to you, the same question to you, as the final question. So let me start with questions to Professor Pentland. So it was very, interesting and very insightful that the concept of data union, which is somewhat like a little bit similar to information bank, which is like we can confer data ownership to data generators, and where maybe the community has more important role for the use of data. But while I'm listening to your presentation, it occurs to me that there might be a few problems with respect to the approach. For example, first of all, there are so many incumbents in the data industry. For example, big name IT companies like Google, Apple, even Tesla, or all the big name companies, they already start collecting the data and in a massive manner. And can we really compete against such a formidable or super powerful incumbent in data industry arena? Maybe that's kind of the first question. And also it's also related to question to the first question, which is, as a data, individual data, collectively, the whole set of data has much more value than the simple addition or summation of individual data. So that is, I think the value of data is while data is collected, it's exponentially increased, which means that size really matters. For example, so that community, as an individual community, wouldn't be able to really compete against such big name companies. So from that perspective, I would like to listen from your answer to the question.
So first of all, let's see. Am I echoing? Can you hear me fine?
Yes, I can hear it clearly.
Okay, good. So just imagine that communities like a local bank or a local government worked with the community to find out about the facts of the community. So where do people work? Where do they play? What sort of health do they have? No one of the incumbents has all of this data, first of all. So it's actually more valuable because it's far more complete in that sense. But the other thing is that community data allows the community to plan, to invest, so they become data holders of the data that matters for their development. It's not a question of selling data. I think selling data is a bad idea, generally. It's a question of getting the right health care. It's a question of getting the right schools, getting the right transportation, the right building for the community's values. And that requires that the community have access to this sort of data. So that's one thing is that it's not a competition with these guys because they're not focused on helping the community. They're focused on selling to individuals mostly. So that's one thing. But the second thing is that, is that the community can be the point where all the different types of data come together. There's only one place in the whole system where you can get medical data, payment data, behavior data, idea data, things like that, and that's around the individual. In every country, it's only the individual that brings all those things together. In terms of scale, there are many ways to do this. So for instance, in the UK, they have local administrations called councils. Every neighborhood has a little local government. And what they want to do is make that local government be something that helps the citizens with their data. Well, it's a nationwide system, so if they go that direction, and we're talking with them about that, then suddenly it's every citizen in the entire UK that has a say for this very rich data. Or in a country more like the United States, you say, well, is scale possible? Well, yes. If you look at, for instance, unions started off very small, labor unions, very small, but joined up over time into a large network that covers hundreds of millions of people. The same thing with credit unions. I mentioned that most of the electrical infrastructure in the United States was built by these small community organizations and not by the big incumbents. So it's very possible to do it, but also the purpose is different. The purpose of communities holding data is for the community to build itself better. That's not the purpose of Tesla. That's not the purpose of Microsoft or other sort of incumbents. They just want to sell things, right? So it appears that it will work quite well. If you have government infrastructure for neighborhoods, then it can work immediately for the whole country. And so many people are beginning to actually do this, not for everything at first, but just for the things that people care about. Healthcare, infrastructure, as the other professor was saying, building their city in a way that is beautiful and human-centric.
Thank you for your answer. It's also very insightful. And perhaps you may think that that data union, I think you already assume that government or any public organization must play an important role of building that data union. Do I understand your approach?
No, I mean, historically, right, labor unions did not start with government. They started against government, right? Community banks back in the United States, this would be about 1870, started as a way to fight with government and fight with big banks. Right? So it doesn't have to include government. In some countries, that will be the natural way, like perhaps in the UK. In the United States, that will never happen. In the United States, it will be local institutions like cooperatives or community banks that step up to do this sort of thing. And interestingly, it doesn't require government to go along because the laws about data ownership and other sorts of parts that are necessary are already in place. And in fact, they've been in place for almost 100 years in the United States. So for instance, local banks are empowered to manage people's data. They just don't do it at the moment.
Okay, thank you for the clarification to my answer and my question. And second question, again, Professor Pentland, is about, I think that open algorithm and blockchain approach is pretty insightful and reasonable approach for the future data provision of data use, so that, for example, if it can allow the data access at the same time, can protect data misuse. So could you please, elaborate more on real examples? Of course, you mentioned it briefly, but we would like to learn a little more about it. Any best use case of open algorithm or blockchain approach for data sharing?
So there are several examples now. I'll start with a government example. So we helped the European Union set up such a system for its official statistics. In the European Union, they don't want to share data outside of countries. And of course, they're very concerned about privacy. And this sort of system where you share statistics or share insights rather than data is a natural for them. And so they've adopted that as their approach. The country of Estonia did this some 20 years ago when they broke off from the Soviet Union. And the reason they did it was that they were concerned about cybersecurity, that Russia would attack them, which it did. And what they wanted to have is a much more secure system, so they set up this open algorithms blockchain system, which has been running now for 20 years there and is a model for most of Europe. That's on the government side. On the sort of commercial side, you see things like we just helped the largest banks in America set up a system whereby they don't have to share customer data anymore. They can share facts or statistics about things instead. So it's far more secure, far more privacy preserving. And that's a company called Koya, AKOYA.com, which handles data for the majority of Americans, financial data of a particular sort. We work with Consumer Union, which is a large organization. It's a not-for-profit that helps consumers get better deals. And they're working on getting the same type of thing set up. And then surprisingly, companies like Google have moved to this type of algorithm because, Google runs Android. Android has perhaps 1 billion phones in the world. And for them to update all those phones and do AI off of them requires moving enormous amounts of data around. And it's very dangerous because it could be intercepted. So what they've done is they've moved many of their algorithms to being this federated learning using algorithms that are open. And now for many things, Google never gets to see the original data. The data stays on your phone. So that's a really radical change. And in fact, just recently, Google updated most phones in the world to this type of system, and almost nobody noticed because it works just the same, except that it's much safer and much more efficient. So it's really worth looking up federated learning, federated AI. Of course, our work gives the legal grounding for this too, open algorithms. And another thing which is of particular interest, I think, in Korea, is that there's another step beyond OPAL, beyond this sort of basic distributed data system. And that is setting up systems which are blockchain-based exchange systems, where you can do this for everything. You change the permissions. You don't have to set up a special system. And what that means is you can now get extremely reliable, accurate, and very cheap movement of data and insights that's very, very secure and preserves privacy. The interesting thing is that the countries that have actually sponsored and built these systems are countries like China, like Switzerland, which are trading countries. So what they're hoping to do is to get a lot of the world, including Korea, to use their systems instead of existing ways for transferring money, transferring other sorts of information. And that should be a little concerning to people because if suddenly most trade happens on the platform owned by another country, that could be a problem. So for instance, we work with the country of Australia to try and build a system of their own like this blockchain system that helps them keep track of trade and payments and tax, and to do it in a way that's compatible with the Singapore system, so that they can leverage what Singapore does, but they don't have to be owned by it.
Thank you. Thank you for the plenty of examples that already utilize open algorithm and blockchain approach for data sharing and data use. And now let me ask a few questions to Professor Jiang. And it was very interesting that your approach, you redefined the urban science. It's very interesting and provide us some kind of clue for the future of city science. However, I have a few questions about your approach. For example, one of the questions is, you consider there are three major constituents in city science. So one of them is a living structure, the other one is urban dynamics and design. And your conceptual diagram, which is kind of subset and superset framework, it just occurred to me that there's three components may be somehow independent each other and more like independent component and interact each other. Maybe that is the first question that I would like to raise. And second of all, you consider there are only three kind of components of the city science, but I would like to add on like a collective desire or collective will of community or citizens, or I mean, the body of human being, body of community can play a very important role for city science. So can you do we have any plan to add on additional component as like collective desire of community, for example? So I'm asking two questions.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting question. First, let me clarify the notion of living structure is really something I would call physics of city science. Very much like we use temperature to characterize the feeling of warmness. So the living structure is physical or mathematical concept to characterize the goodness of a city or livingness of city, or I use the beauty. Of course, many people tend to say beauty is in the eyes of beauty, in the eyes of the beholder, varies from people to people. While Christopher Alexander argued that the beauty first and foremost is geometry, is the underlying structure. So that's I took this concept of living structure or wholeness, trying to characterize the city science, which has, as you indicated, there are three components: how city looks like, morphology, structure, which is very much discomposition, while the understanding how city evolved, emerged, changed, very much dynamics. So both the structure and dynamics can be well characterized from the perspective of the living structure. More importantly, I would say this notion of a new kind of science is to move on towards making or planning. So it's not just limited to the understanding of city structure and dynamics, but rather than how to make it better, how to make it more living, how to make it more beautiful. This is what this new kind of city science aim for. Probably some of that Stephen Wolfram had a book published around 2003, a new kind of science. So my notion of the new kind of city science is very much inspired by this title, but it's kind of the generative science. But the difference between this new kind of city science and the new kind of science of the Steve Wolfram is that under the notion of living structure, we develop a sort of the hard standard, the criteria to judge the goodness, not based on personal opinion or survey, or the people's favor of people's personal preferences or opinion, rather than kind of the structured aspect which can be measured, quantified mathematically. So this is which makes this new kind of science different from Wolfram's new kind of generative science. So this is one tool. And your question, second question, is related to the human. You mentioned the where people's desire, either individually or collectively, how people think the good of the community, the environment. Basically, I feel people's feeling of goodness about the environment came from the living structure. So there's no much contradictory in terms of the measurement based on the living structure and the people's of the feeling about the goodness of the environment. So according to our research, 70% of the human feeling about the goodness are really originate from the living structure. Of course, we cannot completely deny there are some difference in terms of the gender, age, culture or races. There are some, but they account for only a small percentage. So I see basically the physical mathematical aspect is very much probably reflect in the human mind or heart or either individually or collectively. Yeah, that's my reflection on your two questions.
Thanks for your answer. And we don't have any live question from live audience. So maybe it's time to give you my final question. Actually, this is the last, but not the least. I believe the most important question. As you know, the title of 2021 Seoul Big Data Forum, the slogan is Post-Pandemic Challenges and Opportunities for Cities of Tomorrow. So it would not be exactly related to your presentation, but basically the same question to you. So hopefully you can share your wisdom, regarding the following question. So the whole world is still undergoing that unprecedented pandemic. Of course, the level of severity is a little bit different, country by country. But let us assume that eventually the pandemic ends, then hopefully it comes sooner than later. And how do you think, for Professor Pentland, from your data economy perspective, data as a capital perspective, and from Professor Jiang, from the perspective of new city science, that living structure is very important. How do you think the way of living, which is actually quite related to Professor Jiang's presentation, way of living or the physical shape of a city will be changed? Or how do you think should we, city expert, deal with such change, or even more proactive manner? How do you think should we prepare or realize such changes? So I would like to listen your answer or your wisdom from your perspective, data perspective and living structure perspective. This time, why don't Professor Jiang start answering the question?
Thank you. Yes, I just during this dinner, I saw this new wave of pandemic happened in Europe, and even the headline they compare also South Korea, even with 90% people vaccinated, and the new wave is still come. So very likely in the coming months or maybe years, we have to live with the situation. And first of all, to live with virus, and hopefully within 6 months, half a year, when this tablet, comes out, not just the vaccination, but the tablet. Hopefully, we have better life, than now, and also I think this hybrid mode, just at this conference, we on the one hand we don't need to travel and long distance. Although I very much love the Korean food, if I could have chance to visit you, in person. But also, still I stay at home and meet you guys. So this is exactly the kind of the new way of living in the coming months or years. Just last week in my school, we have been discussing to put our master program to be this kind of a hybrid model. So hopefully we can attract more international students who don't need to come to Sweden, just to stay at home and to enjoy this kind of through the Zoom or Teams, to have So this is something I think the not only education but also any other organization would have to survive in such a manner. Probably this is the good side of this pandemic, which force us to utilize this kind of virtual space, or mix up the physical and the virtual. Okay, but as I indicated at the beginning of my presentation, this story about the newborn baby, genetically healthy, but they were born during the pandemic, and the intelligence is pretty lower, as low as that of the Down syndrome baby. So this is a very alarming message that raises the issue that in indoor, the design to make it living or more living is critical, because the living environment or living structure has pretty much the nourishment which subconsciously or unconsciously, subconsciously nurture or heal the people, particularly for baby. So this is something with the issue of design. And so actually not only the indoor environment, but also outdoor environment, the notion of the 15 minutes city, and basically within a 15-minute walking distance, all the activity can be conducted without much traveling. So all these issues related to the concept of the living structure. So how to make it our environment, our rooms, our house, our garden, our street, and entire Earth surface to make it more living and more beautiful. This is something we are facing in the coming year or coming months. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now Professor Pentland. Oh, I cannot hear you. So
Yeah.
Oh, now I can hear you.
Yeah. So as he was saying, we've been forced to be much more digital. So there's a great shock to the system. I think that one of the things that I hope we're seeing is that we're becoming less centralized. Since roughly 1980s, maybe a little bit before, we've seen local infrastructure, banks, libraries, newspapers disappear, and all those functions be centralized in just a few very large corporations. And what I'm hoping is that we'll see that some of these new data techniques and the awareness of people about data and the use of these new digital techniques will allow communities to take more control of their own fate. And what that can include is a decentralization of the cities, so that you'll have more, a central city, yes, but also satellite cities, much more than you see today, and that culture will tend to be much more local and not so much global. And if that happens, I think that a lot of the problems we experience will become less. Excuse me. And I also think that, you know, from a disease point of view and some of the other points of view, it's a better way to live. So hopefully we'll see a lot less of the centralization and a lot more empowerment of communities and sort of a renaissance of local communities building back in new ways that make them much more energetic and livable places than they are today.
Right. Thank you for the answer. And I have one final question from floor. This is to Professor Pentland. And it's also an interesting question, so that I would like to give this question to you. And now Google or Apple, maybe they are kind of emperor. They're governing like a huge empire. And when you mentioned that data union for community, and maybe when we build such a data union for small community, then still we need someone or some small organization should be in charge of data collection and use and like analyzing, all that kind of effort. Then is there any possibility that they, the ones who are in charge of data management, analyzing, all the collection, all that data authority issues, they might be kind of Google over small community? Do you think it's any possibility such a kind of negative?
You're saying, could you have a Google of a small community?
That's right, like small king of.
And the answer is yes, of course. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's something that should happen so that the community can better know itself. And it's one of the aspects of making communities viable in today's digital environment is there should be a community Google, there should be a community social network, there should be a community many other things, so that the communities become much more able to be agile and entrepreneurial and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the clarification. So we don't have any more questions from the floor. So now I think it's time to wrap up this plenary session. I believe this is really wonderful and insightful discussion and presentations. And I really appreciate your participation on behalf of organizing committee. And also my thanks goes to all the audience who participated in the live session. So let us wrap up the plenary session now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.